Ever since I can remember, I've always been fascinated by the moon. My father used to take me to the backyard on the clearest nights, when the moon shone brightest, and we'd spend hours lying on the grass, looking up at the sky. "What do you think is on the other side, David?" he would ask, his voice low and deep, almost as if he were sharing a secret. I never knew how to answer. The moon, with its solitary and serene presence, always seemed both distant and within reach at the same time. On those nights, with the stars twinkling around it, my father would tell stories of space travel, brave astronauts, and unfathomable mysteries waiting beyond the stars. It was during those nights that my dream began to take shape. My father's death when I was 10 left a huge void, but at the same time, it solidified within me the certainty that I would follow the path he so admired: astronaut. In my teenage years, while my friends talked about their life plans, I could only think of one goal: going to space. It wasn't just a professional objective. It was a mission. Maybe part of me wanted to fulfill something he never had the chance to, or maybe it was simply the call of a place that had always seemed to irresistibly draw me in. Now, as I sit in the capsule of the Artemis 1 mission, just days away from setting foot on the lunar surface, it all feels like a dream. But a dream wrapped in something unknown, a mystery I can't fully comprehend. There's something that unsettles me about all this silence, all this anticipation. The moon has always seemed mysterious, but now, so close to finally touching it, there's a feeling I can't explain. My mind drifts back to the last conversation I had with one of NASA's veterans, one of the few men still alive who had walked on the lunar surface. He seemed distant as he spoke, his eyes lost in some point in the past. "The moon is quiet, Carter," he said, "but it's not empty." I laughed at the time, thinking it was just his way of dealing with the fact that we hadn't set foot there in decades. But now I'm not so sure. The Artemis 1 mission crew consists of 4 of us. Me, Commander John Reynolds, pilot Mark Davis, and flight engineer Ethan Collins. All men who were prepared, tested, and approved, both physically and psychologically. I met John on the first day of training. He was the kind of guy who inspired confidence just by looking at him. A veteran of several orbital missions, always steady, always in control. He was the perfect leader for a mission of this caliber. The only problem with John was that he never seemed to fully open up. While the rest of us shared stories and jokes during the long simulation sessions, he always stayed a bit apart, as if absorbed in his own thoughts. Mark Davis, the pilot, was the opposite. Always talkative, always in a good mood. Mark seemed excited to fly anything, from a jet to, as he liked to joke, the biggest tractor in the universe. He was a welcome relief during tense moments, keeping the team's morale high. He had an innate ability to break the ice with a quick joke, which made things easier, especially during long isolation training sessions. Then there was Ethan Collins. He was an enigma. He was the flight engineer, responsible for ensuring that all the ship systems functioned perfectly, from the control panels to the oxygen management. If something broke, he was the guy who'd fix it. That made him the kind of person you'd want to be stuck in space with. He was quiet, reserved, but brilliant. I often saw him lost in his own thoughts, as if mentally solving problems the rest of us couldn't even grasp. Sometimes he had this distant look, like he knew something we didn't. That bothered me a bit, but I never asked. The preparation for the launch was meticulous. The media was going crazy, as was the public. The decades of mystery surrounding lunar missions were about to end, and everyone wanted a piece of it. NASA made no secret of its pride in finally sending humans back to the lunar surface, something that hadn't happened since 1972. I should have felt excited, and although I was thrilled to finally be part of something so grand, there was a growing sense of anxiety inside me. On the last night before the launch, I could barely sleep. I stayed awake in my cabin, staring out the small window. The Earth was out there, so close yet so far away. My mind wandered to what awaited us on the other side. What wasn't NASA telling us? Why were we going back now after all these years? The others seemed to handle the pressure well. or at least they did a good job hiding their nerves. But I felt something was off. That morning, before we put on our suits, Mark gave me a playful nudge on the shoulder and made one of his silly jokes, trying to ease the tension. I laughed, but inside, the feeling of unease persisted. As we walked down the corridor toward the capsule, I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like I was about to cross an invisible line. I looked at John and Mark's faces, trying to find some reflection of what I was feeling. They seemed calm. Even Ethan, with his ever-distant expression, didn't show any signs of discomfort. The capsule door closed behind us, sealing us in that cramped, functional space. It was the point of no return. I took one last look at the Earth through the small circular window, and for a moment, I felt the urge not to go. Something was telling me to stop, but it was too late to turn back. Time seemed to stretch as the capsule cut through space toward the moon. The silence inside the cabin was almost absolute, broken only by the sound of the ventilation system and the occasional crackle of NASA communications. At first, that silence was a relief, but as the hours passed, it started to become oppressive. My thoughts, which had once been focused on the mission, began to wander, searching for answers to questions I could no longer ignore. From the start of our training, something had bothered me deeply. It wasn't the complexity of the mission or the fear of the unknown. It was the lack of explanations. NASA hadn't sent humans to the moon since 1972. That was always stated as a fact, without much justification. Sure, there were the official reasons: lack of funding, shifting technological priorities, exploration of other space destinations. But something inside me said it wasn't just that. Why wait so long to return? John, I said, trying to break the weight of the silence. I've always wondered, why hasn't NASA been back to the moon since the last Apollo mission? I mean, we know the technology existed, that public interest was high. What really happened? John was sitting to my right, adjusting some controls with a concentration that seemed forced. He didn't respond immediately, which made me feel like I had touched a sensitive subject. The silence between us began to stretch uncomfortably. The commander was a straightforward man, and I expected a quick answer as usual. But he kept fiddling with the controls without looking at me. Finally, he stopped and sighed. "Not everything is as simple as it seems, David," he said, still without taking his eyes off the panel in front of him. His voice was lower than usual, as if he were choosing each word carefully. "What do you mean?" I insisted, feeling my heart race. I knew there was something more, something they hadn't told us. This was the moment to find out, to finally understand what was behind this mystery. John glanced at me for a brief moment, and in his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before: hesitation. The commander, always firm and confident, now looked like a man carrying the weight of something that shouldn't be said. He opened his mouth to speak but quickly fell silent, as if reconsidering the idea. "There are stories," he began, his voice low and almost inaudible. "Things that aren't in the official records. And if you ask the guys who were part of the last missions, you'll notice they avoid talking about what really happened there." "Stories? What kind of stories?" I pressed, feeling a chill up my spine. Curiosity mixed with a growing sense of unease was starting to take over my thoughts. John shook his head, as if trying to push away the thoughts that were surfacing. "They're not facts, you understand? Just accounts. Things the guys saw or felt on the surface. But nothing concrete. Nothing that could be presented to the public." I was more confused than ever. "Saw what? Felt what, John?" He went quiet again, as if deliberating whether or not he should continue. Mark, who was in the seat ahead, slightly turned his head, curious but not getting involved in the conversation. Ethan, sitting behind me, remained silent, but I could feel he was paying attention. John finally turned fully toward me, his eyes serious and focused. "Listen, Carter, we're here for a reason. To make history. Whatever happened back then is in the past. Our mission is different, and there's no reason to bring that up now. Focus on the work ahead." I wanted to protest, wanted to keep pushing, but something in the way he spoke made me stop. There was a firmness in his voice that seemed to close the issue. John wasn't willing to share more, and maybe deep down I didn't want to know. At least not right then. I looked away and tried to focus on the instruments in front of me, but his words echoed in my mind. Things that aren't in the official records. What could be so serious that NASA had stayed away from the moon for so long? Meanwhile, the clock kept ticking, and the capsule continued its silent journey toward our destination. Outside, the moon grew on the horizon, its cold, gray surface becoming increasingly visible. I had always imagined what this moment would be like, being so close to something that seemed so distant when I was a child. But instead of the excitement I expected to feel, a growing weight began to settle in my chest. There was more out there than NASA was willing to admit. And now, I wasn't sure if I wanted to discover what really awaited us on the surface. The last few days of the journey were silent, almost lonely. The moon, which had seemed so far away when we left, now filled our windows with its cold and monumental presence. We were trained for these moments, to deal with the overwhelming void of space, but the atmosphere inside the capsule began to feel heavy. Each of us, on some level, knew we were about to do something that hadn't been done in over 5 decades, and somehow that filled me with both pride and apprehension. As the lunar surface approached and the landing module began its slow descent, I felt my heart race. This was the moment. The same dream that had followed me since childhood was about to come true. All those nights looking at the moon with my father, all the stories and fantasies we had created together, were finally culminating in this moment. I was about to be one of the few people in history to set foot there. A mix of anxiety, euphoria, and apprehension completely consumed me. John's voice sounded firm in my helmet. "Prepare for landing. 20 seconds remaining." I looked at the panels in front of me, but my eyes couldn't focus. I could only think about the ground outside, so close yet still unreachable. The moon seemed inert, lifeless, but there was something in those deep shadows, something in the dark craters that unsettled me. 10 seconds, John said again. The module landed with a slight jolt, and the subtle sound of the metallic structure settling onto the lunar surface was all I needed to know we had made it. We had arrived. A deep silence filled the cabin for a few moments. It was as if we were all processing what had just happened. Outside, the moon waited. "Artemis 1 mission, you are officially on the lunar surface." The voice from Mission Control came through, clear but distant. We knew that hundreds of people on Earth were following us at that moment, but here, it felt like we were the only beings in the universe. John was the first to speak. "Landing confirmed. Base, we're preparing for EVA." "Understood, Commander. Good luck out there." I took a deep breath as I adjusted my suit, getting ready to step out of the module. My hands trembled slightly, but I tried not to let it affect me. Mark, beside me, was smiling behind his visor, clearly excited, while Ethan was silently making his checks with mechanical precision. I knew each of us was experiencing something different, but for me, this moment was personal. I was about to fulfill a dream that began in childhood. A dream that, for some reason, now felt distant, almost irrelevant in the face of the vastness of what awaited us out there. The airlock opened with a soft hiss, and I felt the weight of the moment hit me hard. We were about to step onto the moon. We were returning to the lunar surface, a place that hadn't seen humans since 1972. John was the first to descend the metal ladder, followed by Mark. My legs felt heavy, and when it was my turn, I hesitated for a brief moment before starting down. The sound of the metal beneath my suit's soles echoed in my mind, and when my feet touched the lunar dust, a chill ran through my body. I was on the moon. The ground beneath me was softer than I had imagined, and the dust that rose with my movement quickly settled, as if time here moved differently, slower. I looked around. The lunar landscape was desolate. Vast fields of craters and barren plains, illuminated by a sun that seemed paler and more distant than ever. Unlike what I had always imagined, the moon didn't convey any sense of tranquility. There was something wrong with this place. Something that made the air, or the lack of it, weigh heavy in my lungs, as if the darkness itself were watching. I tried to shake the feeling. It was just my mind playing tricks, right? Being here, finally, after all those years of dreaming, was an intense experience, and maybe that was messing with me. But as we explored the surface more, the oppression grew stronger. Communications with Earth were normal, but there was a kind of discomfort in the transmissions, as if something were interfering, subtly distorting the sounds from mission control. I knew the communications team probably didn't notice, but every time the voice from control reached us, it sounded wrong. An echo that shouldn't have been there. "David?" John called through the internal comm, snapping me out of my thoughts. "How's the sample collection going?" "Going well, Commander," I replied automatically, still crouched as I filled another tube with lunar rocks and dust. But my mind was elsewhere. In the distance, at the edge of my vision, something seemed to move. I looked, but there was nothing, just the desolate horizon. The mind plays tricks in extreme environments, they told us in training. But this wasn't just my mind. It was something else, something more tangible. The ambient sound in the helmet was practically non-existent, but there was a background noise, something that didn't make sense. I was hearing a hum, like a machine running in the distance. In the vacuum of space, that was impossible. But the sound was there, low and constant, a deep frequency that seemed to come from all around. "Are you guys hearing this?" I asked over the comm, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hearing what?" Ethan replied, his British accent marking each word. He seemed unaware of anything strange. "This sound, this hum," I continued, already feeling like I was sounding paranoid. John quickly interrupted. "Focus on the mission, David. We don't have time for distractions." I tried to concentrate, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong wouldn't leave me. The moon, which had always been a symbol of mystery and adventure for me, now felt like a hostile place. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence in itself, as if the darkness around us was watching, waiting, and I couldn't shake the impression that we weren't alone. The silence of the moon, which once seemed merely empty, began to turn into something much darker and more oppressive. As we continued exploring the surface, something inside me started to change. It wasn't just the fatigue or the tension of the mission. It was something deeper, something I couldn't fully identify, but that weighed on my mind in a disturbing way. Each step I took, the lunar dust would rise and fall again with an eerie slowness, as if time didn't work the same way here. We had only been on the moon for a few hours, collecting samples and checking equipment. But with each passing minute, I felt my body growing heavier, my mind more scattered. The shadows in the craters seemed to move as we walked, but whenever I looked directly at them, everything was still. It was as if something was lurking, hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "David, are you okay?" Mark's voice came through my helmet, pulling me back to reality. I shook my head, trying to push the discomfort away. "Yeah, I'm just adjusting." He didn't respond, but I sensed a brief hesitation in his tone, as if he was feeling something too. We kept working in silence, our tasks automatic, mechanical, while my mind wandered further and further away. Then I saw the first thing. Out of the corner of my eye, a figure, something or someone, standing a few meters away, on the edge of a crater. I turned sharply, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. It wasn't possible. It was just my mind playing tricks. The training warned us about this. The extreme isolation, the hostile environment, all could cause mental confusion. This was the kind of thing that happened in high-stress situations. "David, you all right?" This time it was Ethan speaking, his voice calm as always. Yeah, I think so, I replied, forcing myself to sound convincing. Just tired. I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. But as we moved further from the capsule, something inside me worsened. That's when it happened again. This time, it wasn't just a shadow or a vague figure. I saw, clearly, someone standing in front of me, far off in the distance, on the desolate lunar horizon. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest, as I tried to focus on what I was seeing. Couldn't be my father? My breathing grew heavy. I blinked several times, trying to understand what was happening. The figure, which I swore was my father, stood there motionless, staring at me. He was wearing the same clothes he used to when he took me to look at the stars, the old leather jacket, the worn-out hat. But that didn't make sense. He had been dead for years, and obviously, no one besides us was on the moon. I blinked again and he was gone. The vast lunar landscape returned to what it had been, cold, empty, and inhospitable. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on my tasks, but I couldn't. His image was burned into my mind. David! Mark's voice came over the radio, and I heard the concern in his tone. Mark, have you seen anything strange out here? Like, something that shouldn't be here? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it was obvious I was shaken. There was a pause on the other end. What do you mean, strange? I hesitated, but I had to share it. I think I saw my father, but he's dead. He appeared over there, by that crater. The silence that followed seemed longer than it should have. When Mark finally replied, his voice was lower, as if he was pondering something. I saw something too, he said, almost whispering. I saw my son. He was standing right there, in the middle of the plain. But he's home on Earth. How the hell would he be here? The cold I already felt in my body intensified. It wasn't just me. We were both seeing things. Is this some kind of interference? Some sort of hallucination caused by the environment? I asked more to myself than to him. Ethan, are you noticing anything strange? Mark called, his voice now more urgent. Ethan didn't respond immediately. I looked at him, a few meters away, crouched as he fiddled with a rock sample. For a moment, I was expecting a straightforward answer, but what I heard left me even more unsettled. He's here, Ethan whispered. He's been here the whole time watching. Who's watching? I asked, feeling a twinge of fear. Ethan slowly stood up, turning to me with wide, almost expressionless eyes, as if he were seeing something none of us could. Don't you feel it? He's here. On the moon. He's always been here. Mark and I exchanged looks. This was no longer just about disturbing visions. Ethan was acting strange, as if he knew something we weren't picking up on. What are you talking about, Ethan? Mark tried to bring him back to reason. You don't understand? The moon has never been just a rock. There's something here, something that never let us come back. And now, we've brought it with us. His words hung in the air like poison. A deep chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The emptiness of the moon, which I had always thought was just a barren, silent landscape, now seemed to pulse with an invisible presence, as if we were being watched, tested. And at that moment, I knew that those hallucinations weren't just tricks of our minds. Something on the moon was playing with us. Something we didn't want to understand. The tension between us was suffocating. I felt that something was stalking us, an invisible presence crawling through every shadow, every lunar crater. But the worst part wasn't what we were seeing or hearing. The worst part was that we didn't know if it was real. After what Mark and I had seen, and Ethan's increasingly strange behavior, we knew we needed answers. John had been too vague until now. He knew something he had been holding back since we left Earth. And with Ethan becoming more disturbed, it was time to confront him. We were back in the capsule and the silence was oppressive. I could see on Mark's face that he was as lost as I was, trying to make sense of what was happening. Ethan was on the other side, mumbling something to himself as he fiddled with his flight equipment with an almost obsessive focus. His eyes were glazed, distant. Something had taken hold of him in a way I couldn't fully understand. "John, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep the calm in my voice, though anxiety was eating me up inside. John turned to me slowly. His face was marked by exhaustion, but there was something more there. It wasn't just the physical strain of the mission. It was the weight of something he had been carrying from the start, and now it was about to explode. "About what, Carter?" he asked, but I knew he already knew the answer. "About what's really happening here," I replied, staring at him with determination. "What happened with Apollo 17? Why did NASA never return to the moon? And what are these things doing to us?" The silence that followed was heavy. Even Mark, who always had a joke ready to break the tension, was quiet, his eyes fixed on John. We knew he was holding something back, and now was the time to let it out. John sighed deeply and closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if preparing to say something he had been avoiding for a long time. "You have the right to know," he began, his voice low and tense. "Apollo 17 was officially the last manned mission to the moon. What the world knows, is that Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt made the last human steps on the lunar surface in 1972. But that isn't the whole truth." My throat went dry instantly. A part of me had always suspected there was more being hidden. The decades of silence, the rumors, none of it made sense. Until now. "The Apollo 17 crew saw something," John continued. "Something that was never officially documented. After Cernan and Schmitt returned to the lunar module, Cernan reported a presence. He made a recording that was never released. In that recording, he mentioned seeing shapes, shadows that weren't part of the lunar landscape. He said he felt like they were being watched." "Watched by who?" Mark interrupted, his voice full of disbelief. "There was no one else on the moon besides them. We don't know by who or by what," John replied, his voice grim. "But what happened afterward was enough to convince NASA to never return. When the mission came back, Cernan was interrogated for hours. He kept insisting that something on the moon didn't want them there, something beyond our understanding." I stood frozen, trying to process John's words. Eugene Cernan, the last man to walk on the moon, had left a warning that had been buried with the official history of the mission. But why? And what did that mean for us now, here on the moon? So, why did NASA decide to come back now? I asked, trying to keep my growing anger in check. If they knew something dangerous was out here, why send us back? John looked me straight in the eye, his expression hardened. "Because this isn't just a mission of exploration, Carter. NASA knew something was left behind on the moon, something we've never been able to understand. And now, with more advanced monitoring technologies, there have been signs that these presences are active again." A chill ran down my spine. The hallucinations, the strange sounds, the presence we all felt. These weren't just the products of our minds under pressure. Something on the moon was affecting us, manipulating our perceptions. Something much older and more powerful than anything we could imagine. "And Cernan's recordings?" Mark asked, visibly shaken. "Where are they? Why haven't we heard about this before?" "Because they were classified as confidential," John replied. "They didn't want to cause panic, and the few people who know about those recordings are still bound to secrecy. But I listened to them. I heard what Cernan said in those final transmissions. He said that we weren't alone, that they were on the moon long before we arrived." "Who, John? Who's on the moon?" My voice trembled, a mix of fear and frustration. He shook his head, as if words couldn't fully explain what he meant. "I don't know, David. No one knows. They've never been seen clearly, but we know they're here. And now, so are we." I turned to look at Mark, who was pale and visibly disturbed. Ethan, who had previously been lost in his own world, was now watching us with glassy eyes, and a slight, unsettling smile was starting to form on his face. Something tightened inside me as I saw him like that. "I knew," Ethan said, suddenly breaking the silence. His voice was slow, almost as if he were in a trance. "I knew they would bring us back. They always knew we'd return." "Ethan, what are you talking about?" Mark asked, clearly confused and alarmed. "They're inside us now," Ethan continued, ignoring the question. "They always have been. Manipulating, waiting. They know our fears, our memories. There's no escaping it." My breathing quickened. The hallucinations, the visions of my father, Mark's son. It all made sense now. These entities were invading our minds, using our own memories against us. John looked at me with a somber expression, finally letting the weight of the truth fall on us. "The moon isn't just a desolate rock, David. It's a portal. Something much bigger and older than we can comprehend is waiting here. And now that we've come back, they won't let us leave so easily." The cold in my chest intensified, and in that moment, I knew we were in a game we couldn't win. The moon, which had long been a symbol of mystery and achievement, was now turning into a living nightmare. The darkness of the moon felt denser, more suffocating. With each passing second, the sense that we weren't alone became more evident. It wasn't just an external presence. Something was inside us, toying with our minds, distorting our perception. The environment around us, already hostile by nature, now seemed alive, pulsing, as if the moon itself were watching us, studying us. The visions became uncontrollable. What once was a shadow at the edge of my vision now stood clearly before me, as real as the ground beneath my feet. My father. He would appear and disappear in the blink of an eye, his face serious but empty, always staring directly at me, as if waiting for something. I knew it wasn't real, but my brain was starting to fail at separating what was imagination from what was truth. Mark was affected too. I could see it in his eyes. The once cheerful and confident pilot was now restless, constantly glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see his son suddenly appear on the lunar horizon. "It can't be real. This can't be real," he murmured to himself, repeating the phrase like a mantra to convince himself it was an illusion. But no matter how much we tried to rationalize, something was moving around us, something we didn't understand, and we were all falling into its grip. Ethan, however, had changed the most. Since John's revelation about Apollo 17, he had been distant, lost in thoughts none of us could reach. His eyes seemed to lose focus, and he muttered to himself in whispers, mentioning things about them and what they want. His behavior sent chills down my spine. Deep down, we all knew something was very wrong with him, but no one wanted to be the first to admit it. Then suddenly he disappeared. There was no warning. We were taking a short break from exploration, back inside the capsule, reorganizing the samples we'd collected and trying, somehow, to focus on the mission tasks. But Ethan was growing more and more distant. I remember hearing his heavy breathing over the radio as he walked away to check a piece of equipment outside the capsule. The last thing he said was a disjointed sentence about hearing the voices again. And then, silence. I looked at Mark, who was also monitoring the comms, and his eyes reflected the same panic I felt. "Ethan?" I called over the radio, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. "Ethan, answer." Mark tried, more firmly this time. The silence on the other end was oppressive. No noise, no interference. It was as if he had simply vanished into the vacuum. John, who was on the other side of the capsule checking the systems, frowned, his eyes focused on something only he seemed to understand. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he knew it. "He's not here anymore." John's voice sounded calm, but there was a frightening tension behind it. "What do you mean, he's not here anymore?" I asked, my voice rising. "You think he just walked off without saying anything? That doesn't make sense, John." Ethan was acting strange. Yes, but he wouldn't just disappear like that. John turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't fear or anger. It was acceptance, as if he knew something we hadn't yet uncovered. "They're manipulating us, David. You know that as well as I do. Ethan, he wasn't here anymore anyway. Not in the way you think," John said, his voice low and almost hypnotic. "What are you talking about?" Mark stepped closer, visibly shaken. "John, we're losing control here. This mission is falling apart. Ethan's gone, we're all seeing things. We need to go back. We need to get out of here." But John didn't seem to share the same urgency. He walked slowly over to the capsule's control panel and began checking the communication systems, as if nothing serious had happened. "Go back?" he murmured without looking at us. "Who said we can go back?" My heart raced. Something in the way he spoke made me realize we were on a path with no return. Those presences or entities or whatever they were destroying us from the inside out, manipulating our fears and memories to break us. And the worst part was that John seemed to be accepting it, as if he already knew how it would all end. "They control everything here," he continued, now turning toward us, his eyes fixed on mine. "They always have. And if they want, we won't leave this place alive." Paranoia started to consume me. Ethan was gone. John was acting as if he'd resigned himself to some terrible fate. And Mark was visibly on the verge of collapse. And me? I could no longer tell what was real. "Ethan, he was taken," Mark murmured, more to himself than to us. "He was taken by those things. Or did he leave willingly?" "It doesn't matter anymore," John replied, his voice cold. "Whatever happened to Ethan, now it's our turn to decide. We either stay and finish what they started, or we try to flee knowing they'll never let us leave." Flee. The thought of returning to Earth, of escaping this nightmare, was almost irresistible. But there was something in John's words that made me hesitate. "They'll never let us leave." The sound of my own heartbeat echoed in my helmet, and the silence outside felt heavier than ever. I looked out the small capsule window toward the vast lunar plain. Everything was so quiet, so empty, but I knew, somehow, that they were out there, in the shadows, waiting, manipulating our minds, our fears, our desires. "Ethan might still be out there," I said, trying to grasp the last hope that he might be alive, somewhere in the darkness. "We need to find him." "He's beyond our help now," John said, emotionless. "Just like we will be soon." My body froze. For the first time since we arrived on the moon, I truly understood the gravity of the situation. We weren't just dealing with an external threat. We were becoming the threat ourselves. Time seemed frozen. The silence of the moon, which had once merely oppressed us, had now become a living threat, as if the very lunar soil was conspiring against us. The air inside the capsule was dense, filled with paranoia and fear, and I could feel that the situation was slipping out of our control. We needed to get out of there. After Ethan's disappearance and John's increasingly bizarre behavior, Mark and I knew we couldn't trust anyone but each other. And even then, doubt was growing between us. Every word, every look we exchanged carried a weight, as if the very space between us was being distorted by the invisible forces surrounding us. "We have to return to Earth," Mark whispered, his voice tense, while his eyes darted frantically across the capsule's panels. "Now, before they take us too." "How? John's controlling the ship?" I replied, keeping my voice low, as if even sound could betray us. "And communications are compromised. It seems like those things are interfering with everything." Mark looked at me, his eyes wide with fear, but with a hint of determination. "We need to take John out of the equation. We can't let him pilot the capsule if he's like this. He's already surrendered to those things." My heart raced at Mark's suggestion. He was right, but the idea of confronting John, the mission's commander, was terrifying. John seemed to be on another level of understanding or manipulation by the entities, and I didn't know what he might be capable of doing to stop us from escaping. But one thing was certain. If we didn't act soon, we'd be lost. The capsule was small, claustrophobic. Every noise, every creak of the metal walls seemed amplified, as if the environment itself was conspiring to drive us insane. I looked at Mark, trying to gauge his determination. He was nervous, sweating, but there was a firm resolve in his gaze. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "We need to be quick. If we try to take control of the ship, we have to be ready for anything." "Ready for what?" Mark asked, his voice trembling slightly. "To fight or die here," I replied, with a sincerity that chilled me inside. We stood up slowly, the fear of being discovered turning every movement into an excruciating effort. John had his back to us, focused on the controls, as if he wasn't aware of what we were about to do. I moved cautiously, sweat dripping from my forehead. Mark was beside me, his eyes locked on John, waiting for the right moment. Then I heard it, my father's voice. "David, why are you doing this? You won't escape." I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing uncontrollably. His voice, it wasn't just a memory or a distant hallucination. It was real as the sound of Mark breathing beside me. I knew my father wasn't there, but something inside me desperately wanted to believe it was him. That somehow, I was hearing the advice of someone I had loved and lost. "David," the voice repeated, soft, almost comforting. "Stay. There's no reason to run. The moon is where you've always wanted to be, isn't it?" My mind was at war. Part of me wanted to give in, wanted to stay in that surreal moment and accept that maybe, in some twisted way, I was safe. But then, a brutal reality hit me. This wasn't my father. "They're playing with us?" I murmured, trying to shake off the illusion. "These things, they're using our memories against us." Mark glanced at me quickly, nodding as if he, too, was fighting his own visions. "I know, they're in our heads, David. But we need to focus. We're taking John out of the picture now." Without further hesitation, we took the final step. I moved quickly toward John, but before I could touch him, he suddenly turned, his face a cold mask. There was no surprise in his eyes, no anger, only a grim acceptance. "You won't leave here," he said, his voice calm and controlled, as if he already knew exactly what we were going to do. "They won't let you." I stepped back, panic rising in my throat. "John, we can't stay here. This mission, it's over. We need to get back to Earth." John laughed, a dry sound without humor. "Back for what?" "To tell the world the moon is the tomb for anyone who dares challenge it. They will never let us leave. We're marked, David. Marked from the moment we set foot here." Mark, trembling with rage and fear, moved toward the controls, but John shoved him with a force that didn't seem natural. Mark staggered back, nearly falling onto the equipment. "This won't end well for you," John said emotionlessly. "You can try to escape, but you'll be running straight into their hands." I looked at Mark, who was panting and clearly on the verge of breaking down. The look in his eyes was pure desperation, but I knew he wouldn't give up. Suddenly, the entire capsule shook violently. A piercing sound filled the air, as if an invisible wave of energy was hitting us. The lights flickered, and the floor beneath us seemed to distort for a brief moment. I felt an intense pressure in my head, as if something was trying to invade my mind. "They know," I murmured, clutching my head as the hum grew louder. "They know we're trying to escape." Mark cried out in pain, collapsing to his knees, while John stood, watching us with an almost satisfied expression, as if he were witnessing an inevitable part of our fate unfold. The pain was unbearable, but I knew we couldn't give in. We had to get out of here or die trying. Summoning all my strength, I forced myself to stand, willing my body to resist the crushing pressure. "Mark!" I shouted, reaching for his shoulder. "We need to launch the capsule. Now." Mark, his face contorted in pain, struggled to stand. The controls were in front of us, but they felt distant, as if something were pulling us back, keeping us from the only way out. The capsule trembled again, and the sound of the vacuum outside seemed louder than ever. The environment around us was disintegrating. There was no more time. It was now or never. With one final effort, Mark lunged for the controls, his fingers trembling as he activated the launch system. The roar of the engines filled the capsule, and for a brief moment, I felt hope. But then, John's voice cut through the air once more. "You can try, but they'll never let you." And in that instant, the capsule shook as if something enormous was grabbing it from the outside, preventing any attempt to escape. The sound of the engines roaring inside the capsule was deafening, but the only thing I could hear were the voices. They were everywhere, getting louder, whispering, laughing, pleading. There wasn't a moment of silence. The voices started weak, but as the capsule gained power and began to move away from the lunar surface, they turned into a whirlwind inside my mind. They weren't just unfamiliar voices anymore. They now took the form of people I knew, my father, my mother, old friends. They spoke to me as if they were right beside me. "David." My father's voice was the loudest, filled with a strange mix of tenderness and reproach. "You never should have come. The moon is the end for all of us. It's the beginning of everything." I closed my eyes, trying to push those words away. I knew it wasn't real, but part of me desperately wanted to believe it was. The hallucinations weren't just visual, they were tactile. I could feel invisible hands touching my shoulders, pulling at my arms. They were trying to stop me. "Mark!" I shouted, turning to the pilot, but he was on the floor, writhing in pain. His hand was still firmly gripping the controls, as if his only hope for survival was to keep holding onto that panel, even as his body was consumed by agony. John leaned against a corner of the capsule, his eyes fixed on some invisible point on the wall. His expression was cold, almost satisfied, as if he had long since given up hope. He knew the entities wouldn't let anyone escape, but unlike Mark and me, he seemed to have accepted this fate. "You'll never make it, David," John murmured, his voice low and almost hypnotic. "The moon, it already owns you. It always has. The journey back won't be what you expect. They won't let you leave here unscathed." I tried to ignore him, but his words seeped into my mind. What if he was right? What if escaping was an illusion? A false hope offered to break us even more. I could feel the invisible weight of the entities around us, the air inside the capsule vibrating with an oppressive presence. Every command I tried to execute felt like a struggle against something I couldn't see, but it was clearly there, opposing me at every moment. I looked at Mark. He was trembling, his eyes half closed, trying to focus, but it was clear that the voices were in him too. "We need to get out of here," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "No matter what happens, we have to go." With one last burst of strength, he managed to activate the next command to initiate the launch. The capsule began to vibrate violently, as if the moon itself was trying to hold us back. The sound of the engines intensified, and the lights flickered, turning the scene into a nightmare, as if we were sinking deeper into madness. Then, the ground shook again, with a force that made my stomach lurch. Something was out there grabbing the ship. I couldn't see it, but I knew the entities were trying to hold us. Every fiber of my being told me we weren't alone, and that feeling grew more real by the second. "David, stop," my father's voice whispered again. I could feel his hand on my shoulder now, a familiar touch that froze me in place for a moment. "You're going the wrong way. Stay with us." My vision blurred for a moment, as if my brain was being crushed by all those voices, all those memories. They surrounded me like a tide of madness. But then, something inside me, perhaps the last rational part one had left, fought to survive. "It's not real," I murmured more to myself. None of this is real. I closed my eyes and forced my body to move. I had to use every bit of strength I had left to reach the controls. We had to escape. We had to. Mark, I yelled. Now, initiate the final launch. Mark, fighting the same invisible forces that haunted me, finally managed to hit the last command. The main engine of the capsule roared to life, and I felt the ship lurch violently as it broke away from the lunar surface. But instead of relief, what came was a feeling of pure terror. As the capsule rose, an impossible sound filled the air around us. It wasn't the roar of the engines, nor the sound of metal straining against gravity. It was the sound of something screaming, something immense, something ancient. It was as if the moon itself was screaming, fighting against our escape. The cabin lights flickered frantically. I looked out the small window to my right and, for an instant, saw something I will never forget. A shadow, gigantic and formless, gliding across the lunar surface. It moved slowly but with a looming presence, as if it were chasing the capsule. It was real. All of this was real. "David!" Mark shouted, and I turned just in time to see his face twisted in terror, the veins in his forehead bulging from the pressure he was under. We're being pulled back." I looked at the controls and my stomach dropped. The ship was slowing down. It was impossible. All systems were fully functional, but something was holding us back. I felt a growing pressure around us, as if the gravity of the moon were impossibly increasing. It was as if space itself was forcing us to stay. "This can't be happening," I murmured, my voice breaking with despair. "It's not possible." Mark looked at me, his eyes filled with fear and confusion. "David, I don't know what to do. I can't fight this anymore." The voices in my head were screaming all at once. They were begging me to give up, to stop fighting, to accept what was happening. The pressure in my head was unbearable, as if it were about to explode. But there was a part of me that refused to give in, that still believed there was a chance. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to block everything out, trying to focus on one single thought: getting back to Earth. "Mark," I said, my voice steady even though I was trembling inside, "hit everything you can. We need to force this ship to rise." Mark looked at me, hesitating for a moment, but finally nodded. He lunged at the controls, and together we began to activate everything that was left: the emergency systems, the auxiliary thrusters. The capsule groaned in response, the metal creaking as if it were about to collapse. The sound of the voices grew louder, but I ignored them. The pressure around us seemed to increase with every second. But then, something changed. The capsule began to gain altitude again. Slowly but steadily, we were pulling away from the lunar surface. The oppressive sound around us started to fade. "It's working," I murmured, almost in disbelief. But then, something unexpected happened. John, who had been silent until now, suddenly lunged at me with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. "You're not going to escape," he screamed, his eyes wide and filled with a madness I had never seen before. He tried to knock me down, grabbing my shoulders, but I reacted instinctively, shoving him away. John stumbled, but before he could regain his footing, Mark stood up and grabbed him. "You're crazy, John. We're getting out of here, whether you like it or not." John laughed, a hollow, emotionless laugh. "They'll never let you leave. You're doomed." I couldn't listen anymore. Couldn't take it. I had to focus on what was in front of me. And then, finally, the capsule broke free of the moon's gravity, the pressure easing. We were ascending. I wanted to believe we were free, but deep down, I knew the fight was far from over. The capsule floated, suspended in the vacuum between the moon and Earth. The vastness of space around us should have brought relief, but there was a sense of urgency, of impending danger, that kept me in a constant state of alert. We had escaped the lunar surface, but the battle wasn't over yet. I knew something had come with us, Mark was beside me, his eyes fixed on the controls. He said nothing, but I could see the exhaustion and fear in his face. We were physically and mentally drained after days of fighting forces we couldn't fully understand or see. John was unconscious, tied up at the back of the capsule after his last violent outburst. He was no longer the commander we had known. Something had taken over him, and that same thing was lurking, unseen, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Earth loomed ahead of us, getting closer, its serene beauty in stark contrast to the terror we carried with us. As I looked at that blue and white planet, I realized how small and fragile it seemed from space. Everything we knew, everyone we loved, was down there, and now an invisible, terrible threat was on its way. The entities had followed us. The communication panel blinked, and a transmission from NASA finally came through. It was the first time we had heard from Earth since we began to feel the effects of the entities on the moon. The voice on the line was distorted but clear enough. Artemis 1, this is NASA. Confirm your status. I looked at Mark, who just shook his head, struggling to find the words. How could we explain something that seemed impossible? How could we tell them that the hallucinations, the voices, the presences that had tormented us were now on their way to Earth? Artemis 1, this is Mission Control. Confirm if you are in re-entry condition. Mark pressed the communication button, his voice trembling. We're on our way. Re-entry soon. But there's something else. He hesitated, as if the words were hard to form. There's a threat. Something followed us. Something from the moon. The response took a few seconds. I could imagine the confused, skeptical faces at Mission Control, trying to understand what Mark was saying. To them, we were just astronauts returning home after a successful mission. But the reality was far darker. Explain yourself, Artemis 1, came the neutral voice from Control. Those things on the moon, Mark continued, his fingers tapping nervously on the panel. We're not alone. There are entities there controlling minds. They followed us. They're here, on the ship, heading for Earth. The silence on the communication line was deafening. This wasn't something NASA could easily process. How would they react to the news that an alien force capable of controlling human minds was about to reach Earth? I looked out the window. The emptiness of space felt darker, more oppressive. I could sense something close, an invisible presence that had infiltrated the capsule like a parasite. The voices that had once been mere echoes in my mind were now more insistent, like a constant murmur on the verge of turning into screams. David! My father's voice was back, soft and familiar. You did what you could. Now it's time to rest. There's no escape. It's all right. I knew it wasn't real, but the seduction of that voice was almost irresistible. This was how the entities operated. They infiltrated our minds, using our memories, our emotional connections, to weaken us. I turned to Mark. We need to warn NASA. We need to stop them before the capsule enters the atmosphere. Mark looked at me, confused. What do you mean? We're already heading back. There's no way to reverse it now. If we land, these things will spread. We need to neutralize it here now before we reach Earth. His eyes widened, understanding what I was suggesting. You're talking about destroying the capsule? I nodded slowly. It's our only chance. If these entities make it to Earth, it'll be the end. They'll consume everything. Mark's breathing became heavy. But what about us? What happens to us? I looked at Earth again, the planet glowing in the distance. I knew we wouldn't survive this. What was at stake was bigger than our lives. Everything we had ever known, everyone we loved, was in danger. And we knew no one else would be able to handle this. It's that or condemn the planet, I said, with a certainty I didn't know I had. The choice is ours. Mark hesitated for a long moment but finally nodded. He knew I was right. There was no other way. We began disabling the capsule safety systems. The process was slow, meticulous, and every second felt like an eternity. The voices in my head were getting louder, more desperate. They knew what we were about to do. "David, don't do this. Please." My mother's voice this time. She sounded scared, pleading. "You can save yourself. Just give up. Let us take care of the rest." I couldn't listen anymore. Every second was critical. When we finally deactivated the capsule's main systems, Mark took a deep breath and looked at me with a resigned expression. "Ready?" I nodded, and together we pressed the final command. The capsule shook violently as the self-destruct systems activated. A loud hum filled the cabin, and the lights began to flicker. The pressure in my head intensified, as if the entities themselves were trying to break through my mind, but I clung to the only thing that remained, the certainty that we were saving Earth. The capsule began to break apart around us. Alarms blared, and heat engulfed everything. The sound of the voices was replaced by the roar of the internal explosions. "This is the end," I murmured, without any fear left. "It was a good fight, David," Mark said, trying to smile despite the pain. "At least we tried." The heat intensified, and then everything disappeared in a flash of white light. I don't know what happened after that. Maybe the capsule was completely destroyed, preventing the entities from reaching Earth. Maybe they're still out there, waiting for another moment to strike. But one thing I know for sure, we weren't alone on the moon. And now maybe Earth isn't alone either.